They're not carrying the show. What do you mean? What do you mean they're not carrying the show? We don't understand that.
There is a particular kind of chemistry in television that cannot be manufactured, cannot be rehearsed into existence, and absolutely cannot be faked in front of a live studio audience. You either have it or you don't. And when two people stumble into it by accident, the way Leah Remini and Kevin James did somewhere between a casting room in Hollywood and a Cuban restaurant in 1996, it tends to leave a mark that never fully fades. Leah Remini has said it herself, in interviews, in her memoir, and in countless candid conversations over the years. Kevin James ruined her for life. Not in the dramatic, heartbroken sense. Not in the way tabloids would love to spin it. But in the very specific, very honest way that happens when someone sets a standard so impossibly high that everything that comes after feels like a pale imitation. This is the story of how that happened. How a canceled sitcom led to the greatest professional partnership in modern television comedy. How screaming matches became a love language. How a friendship became a shield. And why, decades later, Leah Remini still measures every working relationship against a man who used to argue with her about joke ownership at 7 in the morning. To understand why Kevin James ruined Leah Remini for life, you first have to understand where Leah Remini was before Kevin James existed in her world professionally. And where she was not a good place. By the mid-90s, Remini had been grinding through Hollywood with the kind of relentless determination that characterized her entire personality. She had done guest spots, she had done supporting roles, and she had finally landed what seemed like her big break, a lead role in a sitcom called Fired Up, which premiered in 1997. For anyone building a career in television at that time, getting a lead on a network sitcom was the dream. It meant stability, visibility, and the kind of momentum that could carry a career forward for years. Fired Up was canceled after one season. The network pulled the plug without much ceremony, and Remini was left in that particularly brutal position that Hollywood reserves for actors who get close to the top and then fall, not quite unknown enough to start fresh, not quite successful enough to have leverage. She has spoken openly about how devastating that period was, about sitting with the creeping fear that maybe she had already had her shot and missed it. That particular brand of anxiety, the one that whispers you're already finished, is something most people in competitive industries recognize deeply. It narrows your world. It makes you second-guess every instinct that got you this far. And then her agent called with a pitch that, on paper, sounded almost insultingly simple. CBS was developing a new comedy. Blue-collar setting, Queens, New York. The lead was already cast, a stand-up comedian named Kevin James who had been building a following through his observational humor and his everyman appeal. They needed someone to play his wife. Someone who could hold her own. Someone who wouldn't get swallowed up by a performer who had a very specific, very confident comedic voice. What nobody mentions often enough about that moment is the risk Remini took by even walking into that audition. After a public failure, the instinct for many people is to play it safe, to present a version of yourself that is palatable and agreeable and unlikely to offend anyone in the room. Remini did the opposite. She walked in as exactly herself, sharp, unapologetic, funny without performing at it, and completely uninterested in shrinking herself to fit someone else's idea of what a television wife should be. That choice, which was probably less a strategic decision, and more just who she is, turned out to be the single most important professional moment of her life. Kevin James, by all accounts, was involved in the casting process in a way that went beyond the typical arrangement between a lead actor and network. He had creative investment in the show. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that the success of the entire premise depended on whether the person they put across from him could match his energy without mirroring it. He wasn't looking for someone to play off of in the passive sense. He was looking for a sparring partner, someone who would push back. Someone who would make the audience believe, without any doubt, that these two people had been married long enough to know exactly which buttons to push and how hard. When Remini's audition tape came across his radar, something clicked. The story goes that he made his position clear to the producers almost immediately. This was the person. Not a backup. Not one of several strong candidates. This specific woman, who had just come off a failed show and had no particular guarantee of being a safe choice, was the one he wanted standing next to him for however long this series ran. What is striking about that moment is not just the confidence James showed in his instinct, is the loyalty embedded in it. He reportedly went to bat for her in that room, standing firm against the hesitation of network executives who were understandably cautious about casting someone whose most recent project had not survived its first year. In an industry where self-preservation is practically a survival skill, he chose to put his own standing behind someone he had only just met. That is not a small thing. That kind of gesture, early in a relationship, tends to define the entire architecture of the trust that follows. Remini has reflected on that fact in interviews, noting that it changed how she understood loyalty within a professional context. He didn't have to fight for her. He had nothing to gain from it personally. He just believed she was right for the role, and he was willing to say so loudly and at some cost to himself. The audition itself apparently confirmed everything he had sensed from the tape. They started reading the script together, and the rhythm that emerged was immediate and slightly chaotic and completely alive. James would find a comedic angle in a line, and Remini would come back from a completely different direction, and the result was funnier than what either of them would have produced alone. This is the specific alchemy that television writers dream about, and casting directors spend entire careers trying to engineer. It cannot be taught. It cannot be manufactured. When it is present, it is unmistakable. When it is absent, no amount of good writing can fully compensate for it. The executives in that room recognized what they were seeing. The King of Queens was officially greenlit, and filming began in 1998. What followed was 9 seasons, 219 episodes, and a working relationship that defied almost every expectation anyone might have had about what it means for two people to spend the better part of a decade pretending to be married to each other. Here is something that sitcom audiences rarely consider when they are watching two characters bicker their way through a comedic argument on screen. Those moments often require a level of actual trust between performers that is difficult to achieve and even harder to sustain. The comedic argument, when it works, feels spontaneous and slightly dangerous, like either person might say something that crosses a line. That feeling of realness, of genuine stakes even within an obviously fictional context, comes from performers who are actually comfortable enough with each other to risk going too far and know the other person can handle it. Leah Remini and Kevin James built that comfort through a process that sounds, from the outside, genuinely exhausting. They fought. Not dramatically, not over anything significant, but constantly, and about the smallest possible things. Line readings, timing choices, who landed a joke better in rehearsal, whether scene was funnier played fast or allowed to breathe. These were not arguments born from animosity. They were arguments born from two people who cared intensely about the quality of what they were making and were secure enough in their relationship to disagree loudly without it meaning anything about the relationship itself. What is fascinating about this dynamic is how counterintuitive it sounds and how completely it worked. Most professional environments reward the ability to manage conflict quietly and resolve disagreements through measured, diplomatic conversation. What Remini and James had was the opposite of that, and it produced something those measured, diplomatic environments almost never do: genuine, unscripted emotional heat that translated directly onto the screen. Remini has talked about this openly, explaining that by the time they had burned through whatever argument was occupying them that morning, there was nothing held back between them. No simmering resentment. No performance anxiety about getting the scene right. Just two people who had already said the most irritating thing they could think of to each other, and come out the other side of it still standing. When they had to portray tenderness or intimacy on screen after one of those mornings, it carried a kind of unguarded quality that polished, careful actors often struggle to access. The fight cleared the air. What remained was real. This is not a dynamic that would work with just anyone. It required two specific people with a specific emotional intelligence about each other. They had to know, without ever having to articulate it, that the argument was about the work and never about the person. They had to trust that a sharp word in the morning would not be held against anyone in the afternoon. That kind of trust is not built quickly. It is built through repetition, through proving consistently that you can take the hit and keep going, through demonstrating that your commitment to the partnership is larger than any individual disagreement within it. Over 9 years, they proved it hundreds of times. And it created something between them that Remini has spent years trying to find again, and has been honest enough to admit she never has. There is a moment in the story of Leah Remini and Kevin James where the professional partnership and the genuine friendship become indistinguishable from each other, and that moment happened well before The King of Queens ever aired. They had met before the show, before the audition, before any of it professionally mattered between them. The friendship existed first. The work came second. And that sequence, friendship before collaboration rather than collaboration hoping to become friendship, shaped everything about how their working relationship felt both to them and to the audience watching it unfold on screen. By the time Kevin James attended Leah Remini's wedding to Angelo Pagan in 2003, nobody who knew them was particularly surprised. Of course he was there. Where else would he be? He was not just a colleague who had been invited out of professional courtesy. He was the kind of presence in her life that you simply assume will be at the significant moments because the friendship has grown to encompass those moments naturally. Their respective spouses bonded with equal intensity, creating a social ecosystem that extended well beyond the working hours and the studio walls. This was not a television friendship maintained by proximity and dissolved the moment the show wrapped. It was a real one, tested by time and by circumstances far more complicated than navigating a sitcom set. Those circumstances included one that Remini kept largely private for years. She had been connected to the Church of Scientology since childhood, and as her public profile grew through The King of Queens, that connection became increasingly complicated. The church's interest in expanding its celebrity reach meant that Kevin James, as a major television star, became a person of significant interest to church officials. There was pressure on Remini to facilitate introductions, to bring him into the orbit of the organization, to leverage her friendship with him in service of the church's recruitment efforts. She refused. Not once, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but consistently, quietly, and at real personal cost over the course of years. She found ways to create distance between her co-star and the church officials who wanted access to him. She managed her professional schedule and her personal relationships in ways that kept that world away from him. She did this without ever fully explaining what she was doing or why, because explaining it would have required her to be more honest about her own doubts than she was prepared to be at that point. She protected him before she was able to fully protect herself. What that tells you about the nature of the bond between them is something that goes beyond the vocabulary of professional relationships. This was not a friendship maintained at a comfortable, convenient distance. This was someone willing to absorb pressure from a significant institution in her life, rather than allow that pressure to reach the person she was trying to shield. The word for that is not colleague. The word for that is not even friend, exactly. Is something closer to family in its truest sense, the people you protect without being asked and without expecting anything in return. There is a version of this story that focuses entirely on the warmth and the laughter and the enduring friendship, and that version is true and worth telling. But there is another version that is equally true and perhaps more important for understanding why Leah Remini has consistently said that Kevin James changed the trajectory of her career in ways that went far beyond the show itself. He taught her. Not in a formal, structured way, not through some deliberate mentorship arrangement, but through the daily, ongoing education that happens when you work alongside someone who is genuinely exceptional at something you are still learning, and who is generous enough to let you watch and ask questions and make mistakes without making you feel small for making them. Remini has been candid about the fact that sitcom comedy, with its precise timing requirements and its dependence on the physical and rhythmic relationship between performers, was something she had to learn on the job. The techniques that James had developed over years of stand-up, the understanding of when to hold a beat, when to release a laugh, how to find the comedic center of a scene that isn't working and redirect it without losing the audience, were not things she arrived at the show already knowing. She learned them by watching him, by working with him, and by having the kind of relationship where she could ask him directly why he made a particular choice without the question feeling like an admission of weakness. He also taught her about the business in ways that shaped the rest of her career. The question of joke ownership, who gets credit for a comedic choice, who has the standing to fight for a line in the writer's room, how to negotiate for storylines that serve your character rather than simply accepting what is handed to you. These were things James navigated with a confidence that came from understanding his own value. He shared that understanding with her. He helped her see that advocating for yourself and your work was not an act of arrogance, but an act of professionalism, and that the actors who failed to do it consistently ended up with less interesting work and less control over their own careers. The practical results of that education were measurable. After The King of Queens ended, Remini was in a substantially stronger position as a negotiator and as a business entity within the industry than she had been when the show began. She knew her value. She knew how to articulate it. She knew which battles were worth fighting and how to fight them effectively. None of that happened by accident. It happened because she spent 9 years working alongside someone who modeled that behavior every single day. When The King of Queens concluded in 2007, the decision was made not because the show had failed, but essentially because James was ready to pursue other opportunities. The series was still drawing millions of viewers in its final season. By any conventional measure, it had the momentum to continue. But television shows, like most things in life, are subject to the ambitions and timing of the people who make them rather than to pure metrics of success, and James was ready for something new. For Remini, the ending carried a weight that she has described with a specificity that reveals how deeply the show had become embedded in her daily sense of self. When you spend 9 years in a creative environment with the same people, doing the same work, operating within the same rhythms and rituals, that environment stops being just a job. It becomes a structure for how your days are organized, how your identity is defined, and how your emotional needs for connection and engagement are met. Losing that structure suddenly and completely is a genuinely destabilizing experience, even when you know it is coming, even when you have prepared for it intellectually. She has talked about feeling unmoored in the period after the show ended. Not because she lacked professional opportunities, she was a recognizable television actress at the height of her career, and work was available to her. But because the particular quality of what she had been doing, the specific safety and ease of walking onto a set where her partner already knew her completely and trusted her entirely, was not something she could simply replicate by accepting a new project